The Open Highway podcast is a production of Viking Dog Entertainment, and now you can visit the all-new Viking Dog store for access to everything that Viking Dog has to offer. Movies, books, and apparel, including motivational lines, open highway merchandise, and exclusive wolf designs that raise money for wolf rescue organizations. So visit thevikingdogstore.com today.
Support comes from the History's Trainwrecks podcast that focuses on stories like a temper tantrum that changed history, the president who promised not to run again and regretted it for the rest of his life, the World War II general who lost his pants on a secret mission in enemy territory. The History's Trainwrecks podcast, available now.
Virginia, that's just a hub of history, going all the way back to colonial and beyond. Did you grow up in that area?
I did. I grew up in the southwestern part of Virginia. Now I'm in Richmond, and my ancestors have been here since practically day one. A lot of people think the Pilgrims were the first to arrive in America, but they were Johnny-come-latelys compared to the Virginians who came here in 1607. And some of my people came here as early as 1619.
Yeah.
And Indians were not happy about that, and one of them was scalped early on.
Whoa, one of yours?
Yes.
Oh, welcome to the new continent. Here's
yes.
We're going to hand you your hair on a platter. So I'm actually working on a book right now about Roanoke.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So I've been doing some research into the area. So it definitely has a really important part in our nation's history. It always seems to be right at the crux of everything that's going on from the first days, like you said, all the way up until now. Even now we have historic events that are going on there. But you focus mostly on Jefferson and some of the other topics, at least lately. That's what you've been working on. How did you gravitate into that?
Well, I read a book about his mentor, George Wythe, about his death. He was the only signer of the Declaration of Independence to be murdered, done in by a bad nephew who wanted an early inheritance. So I read about his death, and then in the process, I read about his remarkable life and how he had influenced Thomas Jefferson. Some of Jefferson's greatest accomplishments I was able to trace back to his mentor. And so I said, well, we need a new biography about this founding father, this forgotten founding father, George Wythe. And as soon as I retired from my last job, I said, I will write that. Goody, I can write that now. Anyway, I had different titles for it, none of which included Thomas Jefferson. And I realized that nobody would buy the book unless I put Jefferson's name on the cover. So I called it Jefferson's Godfather, the Man Behind the Man, and a biography of George Wythe, mentor to the Founding Fathers. And of course, I had to reorganize the book and put all the Jefferson stuff first, and then some of Wythe's biography later on. But as far as I know, I'm the only biographer or partial biographer of Thomas Jefferson. I stopped when he was in his 30s after the Declaration of Independence. I think I'm the only one to trace the mind of his mentor behind the three things he wanted on his tombstone as his greatest accomplishments. Author of the Declaration of Independence, author of America's first religious freedom law, and father of the University of Virginia.
So what was the response when you presented that book in that format, showing the man behind the man? How did people respond to that?
People love the book. It's rated 5 stars on Amazon.
Hey, can't beat that. So that led to the current book, which is the Metaphysical Jefferson, is the title, right? So that's a different approach. You took a very different approach. So can you explain to me and the audience why that's unique? What is the approach that you took to this book that I don't think anyone else has done it this way, from what I can see?
No, certainly not about Thomas Jefferson, for sure. Well, my first book I called Traditional History. I used traditional sources for that, letters, documents, uh, printed materials that we could find from historic records. And then the second book, called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, which I released to Amazon back in the spring, that is a forerunner, I think, in a new genre that we may see coming in the future, metaphysical history, where you access an historic figure through a medium. And I would not have thought about doing that a few years ago. That would have been the last thing on my mind. But after my husband died in 2013, I sort of went on a journey to study more about the afterlife. And I studied mediumship, and I ran into some mediums. First one at a writer's retreat, and she was able to bring my late husband through quite graphically. And then I attended a meeting where an author, Irene Kindig, had written an award-winning book about 7 readings that a medium had done for her of various family members. And so I thought, well, this book is very well regarded. It won lots of awards, and the medium must be trustworthy. And so I wrote her name down, the medium's name down, and went on her website and made some appointments. And so I had some very interesting conversations through her with my departed family and friends. And so after a while, I thought, well, if I can talk to regular people, why not somebody famous? So I asked her if she had ever channeled an historic figure, and she said yes, she had, for writers. And I didn't get any specific information about that. I don't even know that she remembers. But so I didn't tell her ahead of time that I wanted to access Thomas Jefferson. I didn't want to even have the glimmer of an idea that she might prepare for the sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went on Amazon and I found the authors of recent books about Thomas Jefferson, those who are still living. And I found their emails. Most of them are professors attached to some university. And so I presented this as a class project because I had taught some Jefferson history at the university level.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, here's the premise. If you could talk to Thomas Jefferson, if you could ask him questions, what questions would you ask? So 8 of these history professors very kindly replied with a number of very good questions, which I wrote down.
Okay, so let's pause it right there, just because
Yes.
there's so much to unpack just in that. So before you met with had the experience with your departed husband, were you a skeptic? Were you a believer? Were you somewhere in the middle? Did you never think about it before? Where were you in the beginning of all this journey?
Well, we were all brought up in the 20th century to regard mediums as charlatans.
Right.
I was certainly brought up that way with the things that I read and saw. And certainly there were some in the past, maybe, who took advantage of people. But what I've learned more recently is that the people who are doing this today regard themselves as healers. They do charge because they have to pay for their electricity and their rent, so on. But the one that I work with, charges a very reasonable amount, and I have confidence in her. Anyway, the people who do these readings today, by and large, are healers. Often when someone departs this world, there's unfinished business. A daughter didn't tell her mother, I love you, or somebody didn't say goodbye or couldn't make it to the funeral, or, there was bad blood between people. And so the connection is a healing connection for people.
Okay.
And
So when you so you had your personal experience, was there like a light bulb moment where you said, let's do a historical figure, or did it come to you over time, or how did you get to that? Because that's a pretty interesting place to go. I don't think most people would go from their own personal experience to, wait, how can I go into a larger figure? How can I answer some of these larger questions about society, government, philosophy? I mean, you didn't go small. You did
No,
you went
no, I
big.
did not.
So when did that happen? Take me through that, how you went with that decision.
Okay, we're getting into woo-woo territory here, more
We
woo-woo
got
territory.
time. Woo woo, let's
So,
go.
yeah, okay. All right. Well, I wasn't really going to get into this, but since you asked, I've had many sessions with the medium, and usually she gets ready for the sessions by trying to imagine or trying to think where I am at this point in my life, that certain point. Sometimes I'd be told that I was working too hard or that I was sad or whatever. So before I began the Jefferson Project, I had a couple of readings with a friend who had died, and always check in with my husband and my parents and various people. So the readings that she gave me, or that were coming from my guides on the other side, were we see you as a metaphysical historian. And that came through in 2 readings. The next reading said, we see you as a scribe, writing down very important things from the past to give to the present. So I take very careful notes during all of the readings. They are recorded. I'm sent a recording immediately there afterward, but I don't like to go back and listen to an hour's worth of recordings. So I take really, really good notes.
Mm-hmm.
So I went back to my notes right at the beginning of the COVID shutdown. And I said, metaphysical historian, what does that mean? Scribe, they're trying to tell me something. And then the thought occurred to me, okay, well, let's try Thomas Jefferson. And, let's just see what happens. And
But you had already written Godfather at this point, right?
Yes, I had already
Okay.
written quite a lot. I had studied his early life quite extensively.
Okay. So it pops up, you come up with this incredibly unique idea. Incredibly unique. Because I can't think of more than a handful of historic, at least American figures that I think would lend itself to this. Maybe FDR, maybe Eleanor Roosevelt, maybe, Jefferson, some of the founding fathers, but you zeroed in on one that has been. Jefferson's interesting to me, and part of the reason I wanted to reach out, because Jefferson is the type of historic figure that has been embraced by the left, by the right, by the center, by the up, by the down. Everybody is able to shape his system, or at least attempt to shape his system into their system. So I found this interesting, the way that you approached it. So you approached these professors and scholars and asked them what would you ask Thomas Jefferson? Basically, what was their response on the whole?
Again, they thought it was a class project, and they were nice enough to respond quickly.
Did anybody just go, what the?
Oh, well, no, not at that point, because I hadn't disclosed that this was to be a metaphysical project.
Okay.
They had no idea what I was up to. And they would not have participated otherwise, because they, being traditional historians, of course, they only stick with the material evidence of.
Right. There's a reputation issue sometimes.
Oh,
too,
of course. Yes. I put my reputation out there.
Yeah.
Fact,
So what did they ask? Like, can you give me an example of some of the questions that they posed?
They asked about how he felt about other founding fathers. Of course, very frequently the questions would be about slavery and about his slave mistress, Sally Hemings. We got into that. They asked about his thoughts about current government. And so I wrote all those down. And then, of course, I had my own questions. Oh, one of the most interesting questions was, who was the greatest influence in your life? And I thought I knew the answer to that question.
You wrote a whole book on that question.
Yeah, I wrote a whole book on it, and he didn't say George Wythe.
He didn't. Okay, well
No, he
we'll
didn't.
get to that. But
Yeah.
so what kind of questions did you have personally, other than that? Like what
Well,
was your angle?
my major focus is government. And that's a big reason I wrote the first book about George Wythe, because he uh, modeled the ideal of the public servant, the ethical public servant,
Yeah.
and really helped get this country off to the right start by training the first cadre of statesmen. And we had quite a leadership crisis at the beginning of this country.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks that America was filled with men of the caliber of the founding fathers, and you could count them on two hands.
We had Stacey Roberts was on the show, and he does a show called History's Train Wrecks, and we actually had a really interesting conversation about the founding fathers, because we always go, oh well, the founding fathers were all these amazing individuals, and you name off like 6 of them, but you forget that they were only 6 out of the dozens that were originally. Then we don't talk about all of the other ones.
That's right.
Did anyone, when you were talking to the professors or as you were leading up to it, did anyone want to ask questions about how he saw himself within the workings and the creation of the country, almost like an ego situation? Do you understand what I'm asking there?
Mhm.
It's because I think sometimes we look at politicians and they actually, in the moment, and I use that lowercase p, I guess, they look at the moment and they kind of, we think that they see themselves in this moment in history. Did he just see himself as creating something and he was just part of it, or did he see them, did they want to know if he saw himself as a larger part of something? Did anyone want to veer into his personal stuff other than Sally and how he looked at the world?
Yes, one professor said that there had been a statement that there were 2 revolutions. There was the war, the American Revolution,
Mhm.
and then there was the revolution in government that took place after that. And Jefferson is very, very clear in this book, in the readings that I had with him, that he opposes war of any sort. He didn't say anything about the American Revolution. He was he, uh, he was not a soldier. He was serving in various civic roles
He
at
was a
that time.
diplomat, wouldn't that be?
Governor of Virginia,
Yeah,
diplomat,
yeah.
right, and Continental Congress and so on. But what Jefferson is all about, and this came through in the readings, the recent readings, is freedom, 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 freedom. That was all that he was about. That's what he takes credit for mostly. Of
Freedom
course,
at
the
all
Declaration.
costs? Freedom at any cost, or?
No, freedom from tyranny.
Okay.
And so he said that this is sort of surprising, that the Revolutionary War was, we were freed from English tyranny, but it was simply a transfer of taxing authority, that
Mm.
now our own government had the job of taxing us. And that we carried over a lot of influences from England, some good and some bad,
Mm.
still, that are part of our psyche. And but his refrain throughout our interviews was about freedom, about how we are losing our freedom gradually in this country.
Okay.
Kind of like the frog in the warm water, pot of warm water, just before you know it, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Um,
I want to get into that more, but I want to get the through line, because it's such an interesting story. So you get the questions, you have your questions, you have the professor's questions, you're all ready, you're loaded for bear, you're heading into the woods. So were you present at the readings? Was it were you virtually there? How did those play out?
okay, they played out the way they always played out with my family and friends. The medium that I work with lives in Indiana.
Okay.
I've never seen her face to face, and so I got her email through her website, and her name is Jana Anna, Jana Anna, and So we agree a week ahead of time for a certain hour that we'll talk. And so she calls me at that exact moment. I talk to her. I put the phone on a speaker, and then I get my notepad out. With Jefferson, I had my laptop going on the whole time. But of course, the conversations were recorded. Now, I never heard Jefferson speak. I would only hear what the medium would say. But she would say, for example, I did access George Wythe one time, that he talked in more formal, more quaint language. But Jefferson was coming through very much as using modern terminology, and I had to explain that in the book.
So when she does it, was it a situation? I have to admit, I'm not as familiar with readings as you, obviously you are, but many people are. Does she do it as a situation where she said, so he's saying this,
Yes.
and this, or is it literally, it comes through her as a vessel, or is she actually channeling him?
I think it comes one ear and then out through her mouth, as far as I can tell. She's listening. She is saying, he's saying this and that. That's what she says.
Okay. Now, is it open for, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but just one more question. So is it open for interpretation, or is she literally saying word for word, as if somebody was sitting right next to me and they said, good morning, how are you? And they said, good morning, how are you? Or is it a situation where he would talk about something and she would have to then go, well, he's talking about the freedom in America, and having to kind of like reword it?
Yeah, no.
You know what I'm saying?
No,
it's almost like a translation at the UN or something. You have to translate it into English.
She did her very, very best to bring in his exact words.
Okay. All right.
And even some nonverbal expressions. She said, one of the questions was, would you change the Declaration of Independence if you could write it again? And he said, no, it's a good document and people ought to read it. People are not reading it. You know, they honor it on July 4th, but nobody's reading it today.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that some people are quibbling about gender issues, like all men are created equal. And she said, and he said those are very trivial ways to quibble about things. And then she said that he gave a raspberry noise about that.
I guess he's maybe some eye rolling and some like shrugs.
Right.
I gave you this country and look what you're doing.
Right. But she struggled with some of the words that she didn't understand. And I knew what he was trying to say. And I said, oh, did he say this, that, and the other? She said, yes, that's the word.
Okay.
Yeah. There were a couple of occasions when I did not use his exact words. Only a couple. Well, he repeated corruption too many times. So sometimes I'd say corrosion, or, some synonym for corruption in government. But he said, we were talking about the administration of a certain university. He said, the administration had gotten squeaky. And I said, I don't really want to use that word. I just said, he said the administration needed repair.
Repair.
Yeah.
So how many hours, give or take, of readings did you do, or did she do? And you scribed. You're not that you don't call yourself the author of the book. You call yourself the scribe, correct?
Yes, I'm the scribe. I did not write his words.
Okay.
And I can prove that because I have 8 hours of recordings, and it's very clear in those recordings that I'm the one asking the questions. I'm not providing the answers. The answers are coming through the medium.
So you did 8 hours.
Yeah, plus a little bit. In the book, I say 8 hours, but it's plus a little bit.
Were there any, before we get, I'm very curious what the reactions were to the answers from the professors and the scholars, but initially, were there any was there anything that you reacted to or you weren't expecting or that really jumped out at you from the initial readings as you listened that
Um,
surprised you?
well, the part about the most influential person in his life, that sort of surprised me. And he said about some of the other founding fathers, some of
Oh,
that
what
was
do you say?
surprising.
Gossip. What do you say? What do you say?
Well, we start with George Washington. He was George Washington's vice president for
Mm,
several years. And he said, and again, he was using modern terminology. I had this fantasy, I really did have this fantasy a long time ago, that I would get Thomas Jefferson from his 1826 resting place. I'd put him in my car. Of course, he'd be all cleaned up. And I'd drive him around the University of Virginia. And I would show him, hey, look at the women, look at the people of color, look at these Chinese people. And then he'd be so surprised about all that. But the fact is, he is very much aware of everything that's going on at his university and in the halls of Congress. And so consequently, some of the wording that came through was modern. And so he used a word for George Washington that is a modern word. He said that Washington suffered from what today would be called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that he had seen so much blood and guts in his military career. And his career went back to the French and Indian War. He was a young man when he saw a lot of carnage in that war. And of course, great carnage in the American Revolution. So he said that Washington was not always present mentally, that he had some physical problems, and but that he could always go to him for advice about military matters and other things. I mean, he wasn't saying that Washington was incompetent. He didn't say that. He just said that he was suffering from PTSD, which I can
he
certainly
used that
relate
term
to.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, he did.
Huh.
He did. Yeah.
Did did any of the readings, were all of the readings completely about Jefferson government and his views, or did any of it get into any other sort of metaphysical areas as far, we could, what is after death, what happens, any of those kinds of areas, or did it all stay right around the topics that you brought to the table?
We got into religion and a little bit into reincarnation, just kind of slightly touched
I'd be
on.
curious. So the religion thing, I'm very curious about that because Jefferson has always been put up as one of those separation of church and state icons. So what was said about religion during the readings?
Well, there's a whole chapter on that. And I think that was one of my questions. Jefferson wrote what's called the Jefferson Bible,
Mm-hmm.
the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is on Amazon. Actually, it's a pretty good seller right now.
Mm-hmm.
He, during his later years, he took the four Gospels and he did a cut and paste job. And he compared Latin, Greek, modern languages, all the versions of the Bible that were prominent. And he took out the miracles and some things that he thought were based more on superstition and on mankind's wishes. And he just left the simple teachings of Jesus. And so I asked him if he was, what he thought about that book from his present place. And he said, I'm very proud of that book, or maybe I shouldn't say proud. He said, I'm pleased that I brought out the goodness that was in that book, in the Bible.
Mm.
And he said that basically that men had put the Bible together, some centuries after Jesus died. And they had left out a lot of very important material that would have been useful to mankind.
Yeah.
When organizing which books were going to go into the Bible.
Right. The Council of Nicaea, and when they picked the actual books that were going to go in. He mentioned all of that.
Well, he said men had decided what was going to be in the Bible.
Right.
He didn't say when, but he did say that he was always a skeptic of organized religion, but he had a very spiritual nature.
Mhm.
And of course, today we understand what that means. I'm spiritual, not religious. Everybody knows what that means now.
Yeah.
But they really didn't back in the day. If you didn't go to church and cite the creed, you really weren't a Christian. But he was a Christian because he honored the teachings of Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
And he said that the energy, I think today we call it the Christ energy, is available, that it is real, that his name does have power, that you can call on him. But he said that Jesus had removed himself from many, many churches, that his energy is no longer present in many of our churches today, because they're all about money and power and judgment, and not about what he taught, not
Yeah.
about kindness and generosity and forgiveness.
The churches are squeaky, to use
Yes.
his term.
Right.
So you come away from these 8+ hours, and you had to be, how did you feel? Because you as a writer myself, and as a reporter, I know there's, when you get this lump of knowledge and you come away from an experience, there's this giddiness that you get, because now you get to shape this and not rewrite it, because you're a scribe, you're not an author on this project. But there's a giddiness, because you're like, I have this now, how am I going to present this to the world, and how am I going to shape this and release it so people can learn from it? How did you feel when the readings were done?
Well, I had to make sure that I had covered all the bases,
Mm-hmm.
that could be covered. I'm sure I could think of other questions now, but I had some feeling of satisfaction. It's not a long book, but I didn't want it to be too long. I wanted people just to get the gist of what he wanted to tell us today.
Yeah.
And so I felt some closure there, that I had done what I intended to do. And I really felt it was more of a duty, to get it out there. And I knew that I was putting my credibility online because I do want people in the history profession to take me seriously because of the first book, and they're not going to take me seriously for this book. So I did. A friend of mine said, "Oh, I think you should take your name off that book because people think you're crazy." And so but I risked that, and I've been really surprised by I let all my friends know, everybody that I'd ever had an email with, that I remembered who they were. I let everybody know that it was out there,
Mm-hmm.
and it made a big splash in the beginning back in June. It did really well. It was listed as, for one day at least, the #1 hot new release in political commentary. That's because the sales were up, at that time. And then for a while, it was trending up there in the top 4 Thomas Jefferson books whenever you type in Thomas Jefferson on Amazon.
How did
Thomas
that
Jefferson
feel?
books on Amazon. Oh, that was great.
You like, that was a
I
good
love
thing.
that. Yeah. And I started getting, good reviews. I have people I know and people I don't know have reviewed the book, and I have very good reviews about the book.
So what happened when you went back to the scholars and they found out that this wasn't a quote unquote class project?
Oh, well, I
So
sent the
what rolled with
manuscript to
that?
them. Yeah, I sent the
Okay.
manuscript to them. Never heard from them.
And none of them?
Well, one of them said that he thought one thing we said about one of the founding fathers didn't quite ring true. And I thought maybe the medium had gotten a little puzzled, a little confused about that.
Yeah.
So I took him out because it didn't quite ring true to me either, that because Jefferson had, this is Aaron Burr, they had, tremendous differences. But then Jefferson, from his present place in spirit, of course, everybody's very mellow over there. They kind of forget their prejudices once you cross over to the other side. Anyway, I took Aaron Burr out, and that was the main question that I had from the one professor who responded. But no, I didn't. I shouldn't be surprised by that, because this is a very different way to approach Thomas Jefferson, and they only believe in physical evidence. And I'm sure almost all of them are 100% in the material world.
But you don't credit them in the book. You don't actually credit
Well, I
the
took their
scholars.
names out. I thanked them at first, for providing questions. And I thought, no, I don't want to embarrass these people. So I took their names out. But I
You
did,
never know, somebody,
yeah,
you never know.
no,
What?
but I did mention in the beginning, that 8 kindly people had provided questions.
Yeah. I am curious about Sally Hemings. I am curious about what, and I don't want to get too into all the discussions because we want people to buy the book and we don't want to give away all the secrets, but that's one I have to ask about, because that's the one we hear all the time, because people hold Jefferson up as this icon, but then other people tear him down by saying, yeah, but you know about this. So how did you bring the question up in the reading? Like, do you just straight come out and go, hey, what was up with Sally? Or do you actually ask it? And well, that's a good question all around, is like, how were the questions posed? Were they posed in a more investigative way? Were they just floated as very simple questions to the medium? How was that part of the interaction done?
I held that question off for a while. I didn't want to assault him in the beginning.
What was the very first question that was
It
asked?
was about government.
Okay, just
That
a
was my
general question about
main
how he
concern.
felt.
Yeah. What is your greatest concern about American government
Way to
today?
ease into it. Very
And
impressive.
yes, corruption, self-interest, self-dealing.
Okay.
And so I didn't ask about Sally until maybe the 4th session or so.
Mhm.
And so I led into it. I said, well, we're going to get into some of the tougher questions now. I said, I have to ask you about slavery, and I have to ask you about Sally Hemings. He was very cagey about his response about Sally. He said, I see Sally now in our present state. I have great respect for her. I do not care to review that life because I've gone over that and over it ad nauseum. So I wasn't going to let him get by with that. So we talked about it, and I said, did you have any children with Sally? And he said, again, he was kind of cagey about it. He said, well, there was a physical attraction there, and it was easy to seed her. Now, for your audience who are not familiar with Sally, let me just say a few things about her.
Mm-hmm.
She was his wife's half sister. They had the same father, and she was 3/4 white. Her grandfather was a ship captain, and had impregnated her grandmother on the way over. And then that child, I guess, was the mistress of Jefferson's wife's father. So Sally Hemings came to Monticello after Sally's father, Jefferson's wife's father, died, and left his estate in kind of ruin. And so a lot of those slaves made their way from Eastern Virginia up to Monticello, and Sally Hemings was a young girl then. What I'd like to point out, and I got mad at some of the people back in the day when they were talking about Bill Clinton and presidents misbehaving. Somebody, Katie Couric, I think it was, kind of implied that Jefferson had cheated on his wife with Sally. And that's not true. His wife died when she was still in her 30s. And Sally was just a young girl then. And his wife had endured a couple of stepmothers, and those had not been happy relationships. And so she, on her deathbed, she asked Jefferson to come in, and she said, I want you to promise that you will not remarry. I do not want my children brought up by stepmother. Mm-hmm. And he promised her. He was only 39 then, still a young man. So he never married. He kept his promise. But, he was a normal man with normal needs. And so I don't know how the relationship with Sally evolved, whether there was any force involved. I kind of think that it involved more or less out of friendship. But anyway, so we were talking about Sally, and then the very weird thing happened that I was totally unexpecting. The medium said, there's a female voice who wants to come in. And could she be a slave woman? Because the medium didn't know anything about Sally and very little about Jefferson. And I said, yeah, it could be, because we're talking about a slave woman. And apparently on the other side, when you're thinking about somebody, it's kind of a green light. And they know in some way when they're being thought of. So she intervened, according to the medium. And she said, yes, I've had a really hard time with your two-faced way of dealing with me. You would tell me privately how much you respected me and how much you loved me, but you would never acknowledge me publicly. And so then he came back and said, yes, I was a weak man. You know, I could have done a lot of things differently, but I had my reputation to uphold. But the things that I wanted to achieve, the big things that I wanted to achieve for this country, I had to put those first and put my personal life second. You know, I could have spoken out, but I didn't. I could have acknowledged you, but I didn't. I was brought up, and he talks about his racism, and that he was brought up in a culture that demeaned the gifts of Black people.
He's the product of his environment.
He was a product of his environment. He said that over and over and over again. And so one of the professors had asked a similar question, you know, would your views be any different now? And he said, of course my views would be different now. I would be born in a totally different culture. I'd have a totally different mindset. But you have to remember, I was born in the 18th century, and virtually everyone had the same views about race.
Did you get the feeling, or did you walk away with the feeling? So we're talking about a passage of time, and this is getting really metaphysical, but we're talking about the passage of time of several hundred years since his death. Mm-hmm. So were the views from what you took away from it, the views that he had, were the views ones that he had of the person when he died, or is it a situation where he actually has had a couple hundred years? I don't know how time moves on the other side, or was it a situation where he's had time to ruminate over these situations? You know, it's kind of an odd question, because we don't know. And if you're a skeptic, there's a whole amalgamation, but looking at it, it's like having time to really think about his positions on things and watch the way the world has evolved. And did his thinking evolve over time, or are these just reaching back and being like, yep, when he was there, this is how he felt, and it's the same now?
That came out when I asked him about the University of Virginia. Mm-hmm. He talked about his prejudices, not only or the prejudices of the men of his day, not only about people of color, but also about the intelligence of women. And I said, he said he had to think about not only the people of color who were coming to UVA, but the women. And he said that it was a little bit easier to accept the idea of women because they were more a part of the man's world back then. They were partners in many cases, even though they were not allowed to have university educations and so on. Mm-hmm. But there was maybe a little bit more respect that every now and then they could show some sense. But he was very much a product of the prejudice against people of color, and he had to come to terms with that when they entered the University of Virginia.
So really, and on the other side, in the 1950s, 1960s, he is still evolving the way he looks at the world along with the world.
Apparently so.
That's insane. That's crazy. And I don't mean, I just, It's the fact
Yeah,
that you're still evolving as a human being, even after you're not a human being
yeah.
anymore.
Well, of course, his soul is far greater than one lifetime.
True.
His soul is very benevolent and loving of all mankind, as all of our souls are. But reliving, putting himself back in that position, in that lifetime. But then I said, well, are you happy that, that people of color are there? And he said, I'm very happy for them. And I'm very glad that these changes have taken place. And he said, and I'm going to pat myself on the back, he said, for coming around to feeling that way.
I think he deserves that.
Yeah, but I did want to finish with Sally Hemings. I haven't quite finished with her. Anyway, so after she said that she had been very disturbed by his two-faced way of being, she said, but, we've come to terms with all of that on this side. And she said, I realize now that I did make a difference from that time when I was in the flesh, that I did make a difference. And she has made a difference in the 21st century, because at Monticello, they are telling her story. There are books being written about her side of the equation up there on the mountain, about her children and so on. And the story of the enslaved people is being told really for the first time now at Monticello. I mean, they've been evolving into that over recent decades, but now it's a big part of a visit to Monticello. Yeah. So she says, I have no regrets now from my time in the flesh, because I know that I made a difference.
Did he have any thoughts about being on money?
On money?
On coin, being
Oh, yes.
Did he really?
Yes.
What
he did.
What was the thoughts on that?
Well, this came later. I had to explain that from his place in spirit. He was aware that some of the pictures of some of the founding fathers had been placed on currency. And he said that he didn't think that they liked that too much, that, they didn't want that. But then he said he had to come to terms with that. And he said he didn't think it was appropriate. And especially putting God on the coinage. In God we trust, or whatever's on there. And so he said, then he thought, well, if a little God slips through your hands every now and then, it can't hurt, But the coinage, and he went back to ancient times when the king's power had to be behind the coinage of the realm. Yeah. And this was the power of the United States and people who are running the United States.
Did you ask, I don't really want to, well, actually, I do want to get into modern politics with it, but I won't right now. But did you ask him about any of what we consider great leaders in this country of the past, and any of his thoughts on that? The Lincolns, the FDRs, the Teddy Roosevelts, the Kennedys. Like, what were his thoughts on past presidents that we've had?
We only spoke about the ones that he knew.
From his time period.
From his time frame. He talked about John Adams, and he was very, very positive about the Virginia presidents, Madison and Monroe, who were really his mentees. He was a little older, and he coached them in a lot of ways, and bringing forth a lot of the things he had learned from George Wythe. I call George Wythe the grandfather, the godfather. But let's get back to your question again. Well,
let's talk about the progression of the United States. So as in the conversations that were had, did he pick out any places of specific interest that he was impressed with the way the United States had moved? And I'll broaden it, so not just presidents, but policies, things that we do. You talked a little bit about the university, about how the progression of the university had widened, and he had widened with that. He had broadened his horizons. How did he see the way the United States had moved as a whole, other than the squeaky? I love that. The squeakiness of the machine, right, in certain areas. But are there other people, places, situations that he really pointed out that he said, you know what, well done? Or yes, I think that was well done. What were those?
He did. Well, he talked about, I guess you could call it our psyche, the American psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't use that word, but that's what I'll call it. Um, in his day, he said there was a lot of brutality against the Indians, slavery. And he said that the country in the early days, and of course, a lot of people still believed in witchcraft in the early days, and we were hanging witches, and most people were illiterate in the early days. So he said that up until World War II, and you can include the things that happened after slavery was done away with, the repression that continued into the early 20th century. He said that America, on a scale of 1 to 10, was at about a 2 in terms of enlightenment. And he said that World War II was a huge turning point for us, that we drew the line in the sand and we said, no, we cannot stand for that. We cannot allow this evil to spread. We have to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning Hitler and all Hitler was about. And that had elevated us. And he said that we are maybe at about a 6 now on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of enlightenment. That greater enlightenment was happening all the time. And I see it under the surface. You wouldn't know it listening to the news, but there is a good bit of enlightenment going on at lower levels. And so he said, you could accelerate your enlightenment, or you could go back. You have a choice. You could regress. But I thought that was interesting that he saw World War II as a great turning point in our psyche.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, not just from the idea that we, like you said, we drew a line in the sand and we said we're not going to allow these types of crimes and violence that happen around the world. We're going to stop this evil. But also as a nation, that's when we also during World War II and right after World War II, we started educating. Especially like the soldier boys who came out of places in this country who didn't even know how to read. They didn't even know how to drive a car. We changed the education system in this country. And then Eisenhower came in, and with the roads and the infrastructure, that is a really pivotal time in history. So that's interesting.
Yes, we took a great leap forward in the 50s.
Yeah.
It was a golden era.
Was in your experience, is the other side where he is a finite thing or an infinite thing? Because I think some people think that if someone crosses over, they become part of an infinite, so he could see the future, he could see where the country's going to go. Or was your experience just that he was along at the same speed and the same track as the country? Like, did he say, oh yeah, you have no idea what's coming? Or was there insight into where we're heading? And I don't mean that as like some parlor trick. Like literally, did he say, there's a crossroads, or this could happen? What was there any information on them about the future?
All that has to do with freedom of choice. We have many choices ahead as to how we want to go. He says that that he walks and kind of walks the halls of Congress, the halls that he says were once sacred. He says the new people coming in, he tries to whisper in their ear to remind them of the vows that they took to serve the people and not themselves. He says, I try to end, well, I did say, because he was so gloomy about our government and about a lot of things, about the way we're using the military, our foreign policy. I finally said, well, can't you say something positive? I can't just have all this gloom and doom. And so he would every now and then say that he did see that there was hope in the future if the right people got involved and organized. And so finally I said, well, what would you do if you were president of the United States? What would you do if you were in Congress? I just felt, I should put him on the spot a little bit more. And he said that if he came in as president now, he could do very little because the reforms that he would want to make would be opposed. It would not get through Congress.
Mm.
That he would have to start as a congressman. And he said he would have to gather around him a small circle of integrity, people who shared his values and the need to reform. We need reform in campaign financing. He's very concerned about the money that's involved there,
Mm-hmm.
and a number of other things, term limits and so on. And he said that gradually, as that circle of integrity expanded, someone from that circle, whether it was him or someone else, could eventually run for president and make some excellent changes. But that right now that had not happened. That circle of integrity had not formed, that there were people here and there who were trying to do a good job. But he said, as soon as you throw your hat in the ring, it becomes infected by the system.
Yeah. You had mentioned about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, about interpretation. You had mentioned something about that, about people need to read it. He had said people need to read it and don't just interpret it the way. Did he talk anything else about that, about the way that we look at it? And we're like, oh, well, gun rights mean this, and then mean this, and this is what personal freedom means, and this is what freedom of the press means. And like, did he get into that anymore about what they initially meant by that versus how we not only interpret it but tear it apart nowadays and say, no, you're wrong, I know what I'm doing, I know what the founding fathers were talking about, no you don't? Was there any more diving into that, or was it just a general, like, they need to read it?
Well, I included the Declaration of Independence in the back of the book for anybody who wants to read it. And he said that we should sit down and read all the founding documents. I mean, really read the Constitution. I think there are probably many people in Washington who never even read the Constitution.
Yeah.
But his main concern was the loss of freedom. Of course, the Bill of Rights was the only reason that Virginia ratified the Constitution was with the promise of a Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm.
And Jefferson is very concerned about what's happened to our media. He says the media is being bought out by special interests, and that people are just, and these are my words, they're basically swallowing the party line. And he craves critical thinking. Those were his words, critical thinking. I crave to see critical thinking on this planet. And so that was a major concern of his. Okay. And he said that in the old days, there were lots of investigative reporters rooting out what did he call it? The ball of corrosion or something. The root ball of corruption or something like that. And but that there were fewer and fewer of those now in the media, the investigative reporters. And he feels, and then this is another way that he's very much up to date on what's going on today. This also surprised me. He said that the internet is the only main form of freedom of expression that we have now. He said, and he talked about some controlling powers. And this, I thought, sounded like a conspiracy theory to me. I don't really believe in conspiracy theories, but he did say that there were certain forces that were kind of manipulating things here.
Zuckerberg, Thomas Jefferson's coming out against Facebook and Zuckerberg. That's exactly what.
Well, I think
it's the algorithms.
These are people whose names we don't know. They are so far behind the scenes. They have great wealth. They profit whenever there's a war. They love to manipulate the media and politicians and so on. I don't know who these people are. I kept pressing to see, well, who are these people? Are they the arms merchants? Who are you talking about?
It's they.
I never got an answer to that.
Were there any questions when you were all finished that you wish you had asked that you didn't? Like, if you had another opportunity to do book 2, do you have more that you wish you had dived into?
I can't think of anything right now.
Yeah. Is there anybody, So, but Jefferson is your specialty, and we touched on this a little earlier, but is there somebody else that you would love to dive into in the same set of circumstances, if you were able to reach out to them and have these 8 hours or these different sessions with them, that a political figure or historic figure?
Well, someone said, why don't you do Abraham Lincoln? And I said, well, I'm really more interested in the early development of American government. I'm more interested in the colonial period and the post-colonial period. And I think, the Civil War, we've done that ad nauseum.
Yeah.
And I admire Lincoln, but I would not have the same interest in doing that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't ask the same questions because my focus is that early period that was so important.
Yeah.
And they said, what about Robert E. Lee? And I said, I wouldn't touch that with a 1,000-foot pole.
But like a Benedict Arnold,
Yeah,
to
no, I
dive
actually
in.
don't. The only person that I'm interested in right now is an historic figure, but unknown. There's an unknown colonial woman that I'm interested in. And I don't know that I'll live long enough to tell her story. And I don't know that I have enough information to tell her story.
Oh, never say that. So for those who are listening, or those who come across your book who are skeptics, it still seems like an interesting approach to, and you mentioned this in your introduction to your book, that even if you don't believe the readings, you don't believe the way that you got the information, it's still a very interesting and thought-provoking way to look at the beliefs of this man. What do you have to say to people who come across your book and might go, I don't know about this? How do you get them to crack that spine and dig into it? What do you have to say to them?
Well, first of all, there are only three ways of looking at the production of the book. Number one, I wrote Jefferson's words, and it's very clear from the recordings, which I'll be glad to send anybody, that I'm the one asking the questions and not providing the answers. The second conclusion would be the medium made it all up. It's all coming out of her head. Well, she majored in elementary education. She does not know much history. She hates history. It was not her favorite subject. She knew very little about Thomas Jefferson. Then the third conclusion is that we are hearing from somebody on the other side who says he's Thomas Jefferson. So I do say that even if you cannot accept the premise of mediumship, read the book anyway, because some of the insights are really quite compelling and important, and they are thought-provoking. And this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to get people thinking about our government, our media, our foreign policy, our use of the military, our higher education, our religion, all those things. I want people to start using critical thinking and not just swallowing the party line that they may see on a certain TV channel.
Right. And this is, I'll admit, I'm always a skeptic, and I last as long as I can before I finally give in to believing in something. So I like to ask a lot of questions. Were there any answers that related to you personally? And the reason I ask that is that gives credence to the idea that somebody's overseeing everything. Somebody is seeing something from a different point of view. So at any point, did he point out anything that was specific to you or your research, or a way to connect with you that the media might not know, or that he was seeing things on a larger scale? Or was it all him, government opinions, watching the wheels of the United States in motion?
Well, in the beginning, I said, the medium said, what do you want to do today? And I said, I want to speak Thomas Jefferson. So she brought him, she didn't miss much of a beat. And because, of course, he had the green light, he already knew. Well, I had another session with him when I was doing the George Wythe book, although I didn't put it in that book. And he knew that I was going to call on him and ask him to tell me some things about George Wythe. He said, I've been waiting to hear from you. Oh. He had the green light. Anyway, so I asked him early on, I said, I have this idea for a book. I said, what do you think about it? Do you want to collaborate with me on that? And he said that he would, because he thought my heart was in the right place, that I was not doing it to get famous or to make money, which I'm not. I just want it out there. I want a lot of people to buy the book, but I don't intend to expect to get rich on it by any means. So then after it was, after it was published, well, let's see. Yeah, right when it was published, I had another reading with a medium. A friend of mine had died, but I asked to, and this was really funny. I accessed Thomas Jefferson first, and then my husband next. And my husband said, well, I want to come first next time because that's a hard act to follow. So I asked Thomas Jefferson if he was pleased with the book. And he said he was very pleased with it. And he was glad that I had done the book.
Oh, okay. So what's, I know you're working on several projects right now. What's next up in the hopper? What's your next book?
Well, I want to distill what I was trying to get across in the George Wythe book into a shorter book called America's First Leadership Crisis, 1776, and how things could have gone very much in the wrong direction without some of these early leaders. So George Wythe teaching about ethical statesmanship. And so I want to say that our great democratic republic was not a given. When we issued our divorce papers to England on July 4th, 1776, we had no government. We have no replacement for king and parliament and English governors. We had a very loose confederation of states. The Continental Congress with no power. They did not have taxing power and so on. And, we could have gone the way of South America, pretty easily. Virginia considered itself an independent country.
Yeah.
Its borders went as far, it was larger than many European countries. Its borders went as far as Mississippi. So that book will be about what it took to get a good group of leaders getting this country going in the right direction.
Okay.
And I have a book of poems, and then I have a novel that I wrote 10 years ago that's been on the shelf. So I've got a lot of projects.
So if people go to your website, they can connect with your past works. What's your website? Where should we send people?
The authors, well, you can go on Amazon, and there's a brief profile of me on Amazon. And the two books are Jefferson's Godfather, The Man Behind the Man, and that's the George Wythe biography. And the other one is The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. I have an author website, and I'm on LinkedIn. If you go to LinkedIn and type my name in, Suzanne Munson, you'll find some podcasts there and background about me. And then my author site is Suzanne Munson-author.com.
And we'll put all of those in the show notes too, so people can go check out the show notes and click directly through to your site and to your books. It's been a really interesting conversation. I'm going to read the book. I actually want to read the ideas, because even if you're a skeptic or not, I think it's a really interesting approach, a really interesting way to get some of these ideas out. Jefferson wasn't a simple man, no matter how you look at it. And I think too many people, as we talked about when we started this, set him up on this pedestal and just go, well, he was one of the founding fathers, and let's not discuss all the shades of gray around the way he thought about stuff. So it's a really interesting approach. Suzanne, I appreciate this so much. Thanks for spending time with me. Everybody go check out The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. The links are in the show notes. I look forward to seeing where you go next with it. I look forward to the next book. Sounds interesting as well, because we could have become South America. We could have become president for life. All those were definite possibilities back in the 1700s. So
yes, people still wanted a king. They wanted George Washington to be king, or or King George III's second son to come over and be our king. They just didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
So we were very fortunate. Yeah.
Finish that book because I want to read it, and then we'll promote that. So
Yes.
thank you so much. Appreciate you spending some time with me.
I enjoyed it very much, Eric.
I'm glad.
This episode is brought to you by Our Weird World. Every week, I, John Henson, dive into weird, crazy, and forgotten stories from the history books that you have probably never heard before. I try to put some humor into it, or maybe I just come off sounding like a dick. That's really up for you to decide. But join me every Monday. Subscribe everywhere that you get your podcasts.
Hey everybody, hope you enjoyed the show. Help us spread the word by subscribing and leaving a review. If you want to support us even more, you can find a link to our Patreon account in the show notes. And if you're one of our diehard fans, head on over to the VikingDogStore.com where you can find official Open Highway merchandise to show your support to the entire world. But most of all, thanks for listening.
For the highways of America, which for so many years were an assortment of as many designs and pavements as there were states, are now becoming one big road that can take you anywhere faster, safer, and more directly than ever before. What is this big road? Where is it going? How much has been built? How much is yet to come? These are questions we ask. Certainly traveling the entire system would be a memorable experience, but few of us have the time for such a trip.
All rights reserved. Viking Dog 2021.